evening's guest lecture. For those of you who are new to UCL and to the Institute for Sustainable Heritage, we organise these lectures in memory of Professor Nigel Seeley, who was head of conservation at the Institute of Archaeology here at UCL, though it wasn't part of UCL at the time, for many years. He subsequently went to be head of conservation at the National Trust and was visiting professor with the Institute for Sustainable Heritage when we started in 2001, and was a great mentor and also my teacher, my conservation teacher at the Institute, where I met Julian Bowsher. Julian studied Roman archaeology at the London Institute of Archaeology, which is now part of UCL. He then spent a number of years working abroad, which included the excavation of a Roman theatre in northern Jordan. Since joining the Museum of London 30 years ago, he has maintained his classical interests through being the Museum of London archaeology numismatist. He fell, however, into the modern, that is Tudor world, that has incorporated the Shakespearean playhouses and other monuments of post-medieval London. Julian now digs a desk, and he has published numerous books and articles and has lectured and taught over large parts of the globe. And of course, in this anniversary year, 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, which we are commemorating, this is most appropriate. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you very much, May. It seems only, I do remember Nigel Seeley. I was actually taught by him. But it does seem only a few years since your distinguished director and I and the students around the corner. So it's good to be back. I've been interested in, as May mentioned, in theatre archaeology for a long time. It's ranged from the 2nd century AD Roman theatre. In passing, I'll mention that that is yet another theatre that was rebuilt in a different style, they all are, to Victorian music halls. So occasionally I've seen performances in modern theatres too. I'm basically going to talk about London, which is where this theatrical and Shakespearean archaeological phenomenon was largely based. But there were a few provincial venues. These things popped up in York and in Bristol, which is not surprising, they were big cities. But at smaller places like Tunbridge in Kent, and even smaller place like Prescott in Lancashire, both related to theatrical patrons. But as one born in the Northwest, and in fact associated with the Shakespeare North project, I cannot fail to jump up and down and say how delighted I am that we heard yesterday that funds are available for Prescott regeneration. Right, advert over. So, Shakespeare. 5 minutes searching on Google for Shakespeare will reveal within a nanosecond that Shakespeare himself needs no sustenance whatsoever. In fact, actually, you probably need 5 years on Google to find everything Shakespearean. He's known all over the world. It's thought that a different play of his is put on somewhere in the world every single day. This year, as May has intimated, we'll see an absolute frenzy of Shakespearean studies, amounting to worship almost. As I'm an archaeologist, historian, rather than a literary scholar, I'm largely using Shakespeare as a representative of all those playwrights, all those actors, all those managers, even the audiences, who lived in theatreland, London's theatreland. There definitely were some scoundrels in the theatre world of the time, and that does add colour to the bricks and mortar that the archaeologists dig up. Shakespeare was no angel either. He defaulted on his rates, he hoarded grain, and so on and so on. Hundreds of books and articles are written about William Shakespeare every year, but none of them, including mine, tell us anything new about Shakespeare the person. But once we move into archaeology, we can begin to understand a bit of his milieu, his working environment. Which one was it? And what's happened in Stratford-upon-Avon, at the site of New Place, Shakespeare's house, they have found, and this is the essence of it, It looked like that. It was only pulled down in the 18th century. It's the house that Shakespeare lived in and bought. It was pulled down in the 18th century by the then occupant, who was fed up with people knocking on his door wanting to see a bit of Shakespeare heritage, so he pulled it down and built himself a nice new Egyptian house. Unsustainable, really. And this year they found, or last year they found part of what they're saying is Shakespeare's kitchen and part of the foundations, which are certainly telling us about the building and how wealthy it was. The other bit of Stratford archaeology I like is a few hundred yards away from the main building, is a theatre built in 1827. This is, if you like, a Shakespearean theatre of the 19th century, and it's a nice tradition to keep that. But London is what we should look at, and we do know from the fairly extant historical sources how many of these venues there are, or were. And you can see that we've divided them into types with these vast number of playhouses outside, which are usually defined as the outside type, the globe type, if you like, open air. Whereas, and this is what they call them at the time, you can call them what you like today, but anyway, that's what they called them at the time. The theatres tend to be the indoor ones, which are much more expensive to get into. You need artificial lighting, and it's a different kettle of fish. And those ones were tolerated inside the city. Outside, of course, land is cheaper, land is more available. It's not quite as simple just to say that it was a Puritan opposition to these things. What we've been able to do there, therefore, is look at his working environment. And that's where they mostly are. We've done excavations on the theatre, 1576, the curtain, 1577-ish, the rose, 1587, the globe, 1599, the hope, 1613. We've tried to find that at 1598, but it's gone. We do know roughly where all the other ones are. So archaeology and Shakespeare, not the obvious connection a few years ago. You could talk about Shakespearean archaeology in the archives. There is a vast amount, and very occasionally, certainly within the last 30 years, there have been new nuggets found in archives, either Dulwich College or the National Archives. In fact, serious documentary research has always really been an integral part of archaeology, particularly perhaps for this post-medieval period. But in 1989, the excavation of the Rose and the Globe, archaeology actually had the audacity to climb on the Shakespearean stage. And it's probably fair to say that the evidence uncovered transformed our knowledge of playhouses of Tudor and Stuart London, which was a very small place. Shoreditch, where the theatre and curtain are just off the map there. Bankside, which is where this is early. This is a map of the 1560s, so the Rose and Globe and so on are there. Those things are actually bare dating arenas. Newington Butts would be off the map, so would Mile End, where the Red Lion was. But it's a fairly small environment. Hitherto, the study of playhouses has been a very rather niche academic quest, but times have changed for that. The national curriculum for schools in Britain, for example, stresses the importance of Shakespeare as a dramatist, and thus the importance given to an understanding of the original physical environment wherein Shakespearean drama was first played. Such a performative context is also viable for literary criticism too. The strategy document drawn up by the Museum of London and MOLA a number of years ago stressed the importance of London's rich theatrical heritage, and it's discussed and emphasised as a major archaeological theme. So we've got two positive, sustainable attitudes there to start with. Much has been written about these playhouse sites since their archaeological discovery, and close cooperation with a variety of disciplines has resolved many issues. Issues that have largely concentrated on the nature of the buildings and their design. But archaeology strives for a greater understanding of human activity within those buildings. In other words, any archaeologist can dig up four walls and say, well, they roughly date to this, but what happens inside? That's what the interesting bit, if you like. what architects call form and function. Playhouses, however, have a definable function and provide a fairly clear picture of what activities were taken within them. It's fairly simple. You've got audience areas, you've got this as an example is the Rose excavations. There are different phases, including 1950s concrete phases, but you've got a stage, two of them in fact. You've got an area where people could stand, you've got an area where people could sit, and you've got a backstage area which is presumably a management area. So what we're interested in is, having defined that fairly simply, unlike perhaps the rooms of a Saxon house, which room was used for what, kitchen, bedroom, whatever. We can then look at the actual interaction between those users, management, actors, audience. It's probably much more with the actors and the audience. And interestingly, at the time of and this was the very first excavation of a so-called Shakespearean playhouse, it was very new, the world went bonkers about it, nearly killed me. At the time of the excavation, though, it seemed that archaeology had actually intruded on the sedate academic world of Shakespearean studies. It sometimes appears that the archaeologists were accused of not understanding the finer points of theatre history. Conversely, many of the earlier publications on the Rose, and to the less extent the Globe, were written by scholars who, we felt, didn't quite understand archaeology. And in fact, at this point, I'd like to mention an excellent book on the archaeology of Shakespeare by Jean Wilson, who discussed this thing, this antagonism, which has now completely disappeared, and said what a lost opportunity we should have got together, which we have done now. So life is rosy now with the entire world. Moreover, there were some archaeologists who thought the 16th and 17th century were a bit too modern anyway. However, there was one historian, Glyn Wickham, who suggested that there was a difference, and this is quite a crucial point actually, there was a difference between the dogmatism of 20th century historians and the pragmatism of Elizabethan and Jacobean actor managers and their actors, not the rest of it. So what we have managed to do is open this debate and look at a number of different ways at these buildings. I put the Rose up first. It wasn't the first one built, but it's simply the one that we have the most archaeological information. We've got, as you can see, almost 2/3 of it. Secondly, therefore, we have a much better stratigraphic understanding. We found more at it. And the other thing that makes it rather unique is that the papers of its owner, Philip Henslow, still survive. I'm quite sure that all of the managers of these buildings kept accounts and so on, like any businessman would do today. But his are the only ones that survive. They're in Dulwich College, and they provide an incredibly rich detail of what went on in there, which plays were put on, how much money he got as income. He also talks about spending money on the building, which nobody really understood what he was going to do. But we did reveal that as well. A lot of our evidence is positive as well as negative. Archaeology is not going to provide every single answer, certainly for some of the other excavations which we'll see. But we have defined a sort of lineage, which I'll go through in a moment. And at the same time, a fresh review of documentary accounts is debunking some of the favourite dreams and myths. For example, the theatre was dismantled, taken over the river, and rebuilt as the Globe. No. That all playhouses had their stages at the southern end, which is an area of even light in the afternoon, because that's where the Globe stage was. No, they're actually north, south, east or west, depending where they're built. A lot of the early research hailed the Globe, Shakespeare's Globe, as the one sort of paradigmatic playhouse, and it was thought that everyone else's were like that, because of course there couldn't possibly be anything else apart from where the great Shakespeare was working. I'm in danger of getting jaded about Shakespeare. And things like distance. You saw, I don't know how to go back, but I just wanted to show you again that some of the early theatre histories will describe the extraordinary movement from Shoreditch, which is sort of the first theatrical area in London, if you like, decamped for various reasons I'll come to the bankside here. And I said, why on earth would they go miles and miles and miles away? Well, actually, it's an average of 35 minutes walk. I've done it back and forth, and 35 minutes is the average. So there's that needs debunking as well. The excavations have provided a fantastic body of hard evidence, because what we had before were various accounts, particularly some enigmatic, some maps, some guesswork, but for the first time in 400 years we have some concrete evidence. The other thing we've got is the great boom in reconstructions. In fact, actually, reconstructions started in the 19th century. And certainly one of the most famous ones was the 1910 globe built in Chicago for the World Fair. Since then, there's a globe in nearly every single country in the world, and some countries have more than one. I think ours is great. But we're also going to look at these sorts of buildings because they are reconstructions, they are working environments. This is an example of one which hasn't yet actually been built, but we've been working with them in Lenox, Massachusetts. This one's a rose, not it really matters. The next one along will be a globe. They all look the same, don't they? But these are working theatres, and if you go to the globe on the South Bank today, which we call Globe 3, it's a performative venue. You couldn't make a complete replica. You'd be thrown out for health and safety positions to start with. But they've learned something from our excavations when we went over there. We've learned something about how you do whatever you do in a playhouse, in other words, act. Although some of them are being propelled perhaps by Shakespeare, MOLA and all the others. Are they going to become heritage parks? Are they going to theme parks? Whatever they are, they're audience attractions, theatrical or even non-theatricals. Shakespeare is an enormously magnetic person, and marketable, of course. But this is a form of sustaining, in a sense. Is a heritage park the worst kind of sustaining than an academic one that's seeing other people's work? The reconstructions were the fruit of very much research and provided stages on which to test dramatic usage of such buildings. In other words, they're what we, the archaeological world, would call experimental archaeology. We all know about putting on a few rags and living in an Iron Age hut and going off to slaughtering a sheep and all the rest of it. But this is the same idea. You build a replica building, near enough replica, and you now know what the stage dimensions are. You now know what your relationship to the audience and the rain and everything else is. And that's where you want to, that's where you've got a recreated stage and its theatrical environment, which are used to test the application of dramatic texts, thereby learning something about original performance practices. And the actors are terribly keen on this. The Wanamaker Globe, or Globe 3 as we call it, broke new ground in its founders' assembly of a team of scholars, including literary academics, historians, architects, and after a while, archaeologists, whose research was intended to produce the most accurate reconstruction of the globe. Curiously enough, we don't actually know as much about the globe in documentary terms than, for example, the Rose or the theatre. And let me be slightly honest, they were slightly globe-centric, as I mentioned earlier. There's also this thing, the Shakespearean love, and that gives also a very good idea. If any of you've been to the globe, seen the film or whatever, it does resonate. This thing actually is possibly going to be part of Shakespearean law. It was for a long time sitting, this entire set was for a long time sitting in, I believe, David Judy Dench's garage or something. One of the things I want to point out right now, though, are the people pressing at the front of the stage, right in your face. So let's have a look at most of these sites. Oh, and there's another reconstruction, that's what I'm talking about. It's slightly larger than the original, but as I say, it's a modern building. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, I've been to see plays there. The first time I actually went to see a play, I spent all of my time looking at how people were moving around and how they were using the building. That's what fascinated me. It was Romeo and Juliet, and I do know the story of that one, so I can afford to ignore that. Right, the first one that we have any dealings with is the theatre, capital T, an interesting classical name they're using, built by James Burbage in 1576. This also has quite a good documentary history, because Burbage was an absolute scoundrel, and he sued everyone, and everyone sued him, and he was arrested all the time. So you just have to look through the Middlesex Sessions book and get a vast amount of information. It looks like a fairly simple polygon, and that, as I say, we do have another myth that we've passed, that the stages are always in the south. Stages are opposite the entrance. Seems logical to us. That's where the public goes in. You want the public, you want the money, they want to see a play. We have only found a small area, but there are, happily, enough angles to be able to give a rough idea, and it's roughly 22 metres across externally, or 72 feet. The other thing that is fairly constant is, the actual bays of the polygon are 12'6" across 3.8 metres, which actually turns out to be a standard Tudor building measurement. And you can look at all sorts of domestic houses. You can look at Treswell's surveys of 1612, and lots of other buildings have that 12'6". So it seems to be not only common within these playhouse buildings, but also within Tudor and early Jacobean buildings generally. So we've got most of the elements. We assume the stage is going to be there. We assume the entrance is going to be there. Fairly simple. Oops. There is a fantastic, if you go on the web, find this thing called Explore the Theatre, because what they did is look at all of our detailed measurements, which didn't include the roof, of course, but a lot of very good reasoning, and Heather and I spent hours and hours with them, and the result going around this thing in 3D is fascinating and taught us something about sight lines and how you can work and move around inside one of these things. A lot of the measurements are taken from the rows, which we think was based on the theatre and appears to be the same size. We have a little problem. This is a map, an undated map, sorry, a panorama, and in fact this is only a tiny bit of a very long one, London from the north. And it shows this thing here, which looks to virtually everyone to be one of these polygonal playhouses. And debate has raged between whether it's the theatre or its near neighbour down the road, the Curtain. And for a long time, it looked as though most people thought it was the theatre. Then there was a backlash, certainly an article in 2002, saying it was the Curtain, and it sort of started swinging that way. This is, even so, it doesn't fit entirely with them. I mentioned it's actually part of a long panorama, and once you get it onto, put it next to an old survey map, and click in things like church spires, which there aren't any here, but I mean, at least something like that or whatever, you can actually work out its orientation, and it's not terribly accurate. It could be either one. We have done some excavations on the Curtain, some very limited trenches a few years ago, and found a wall 12.5 foot apart, and another trace of a possible wall up there, which, bingo, was also 72 foot. So we thought, there you go, that's it, that's easy. Some more work, more recently, shows that it's not a polygon. It's more likely to be a square, which is a bit perplexing. So that knocks that engraving out of the window, to start with. It's also, apart from the one in Newton Butts, the only building where there is no documentary evidence for it being built. But we do have information about a large building called Curtain Close that was certainly extant in the 1560s, and it could well be just adapted into it. We know of other buildings that have been adapted into theatres. But when Heather starts re-excavating it, it's going to be very interesting to see what it is. And that building seems to have survived right throughout the 17th century, with just a little kind of bit, well, all right, 40 odd years in the middle, when it was actually used as a playhouse. So that's going to be something to get interested about. And in terms of regeneration, heritage, and so on and so on, I know that this is slightly out of date, but the development on the site, which is massive, is going to have its little Shakespearean box down here. I don't know what it shows, but in fact nobody knows exactly what it's going to look like, do we yet? So anyway, that is modern commercial archaeology, reflecting modern developers who no longer quite think of archaeologists as wretched nuisances, as they used to do. They realise that they can get PR out of it as well. So a lot of these are turning up. And coming back to the Rose, which this is 1989, a very long time ago, I'll just point out quickly that, say, you can see the outer wall here, and an inner wall, an open yard, and a stage, 1950s concrete. It then changes, as I say, all archaeologists know the buildings change all the time. So that's what it is, a fairly simple thing, and you can recognise the plot of the theatre we've been talking about. Stage, yard, and in fact we know that that's a what was called a sewer, but that doesn't mean waste, it's actually an irrigation ditch. Sorry, a drainage ditch. And we know that the entrance at the southern end, in fact we found fragments of that entranceway. So a fairly simple one. Henslow, as I mentioned, spent £108 in 1592 about my playhouse, and then there's a long list of building materials. What on earth was he doing? Well, only archaeology has found out. He built, back there, enlarged the entire backstage, or the entire northern area with the new stage. He's pushed out the wings here. The southern bit hasn't moved at all. It's not going to escape your notice that the whole thing is to do with the stage. That's the business end. That's where you want the attraction. That's also where the actors want different movement. That's also where you can, with the advent of a couple of pillars, now have a roof on it. You can swing down. So a lot of special effects and all the rest of it. All these places were in deep competition. There is a fragmentary reference from the theatre, the legal cases, about spending £30 to £40 on some reparations. What they were doing, I don't know, but clearly not something as extensive as that cost £108. So there's, as I say, there is certainly written evidence for competition and physical evidence. Well, it's become obligatory for me now to show you what sort of sustained heritage is going to be associated with these things, and this is again an out-of-date idea of what's going to happen at the Rose site one day when they get their X million. They want to keep the remains with a glass floor on top and have a theatre space in there as well. I believe it's a movable piece. It isn't finalised. Then we come on to an unsustainable one. This is the Swan, built in 1595, about 400 yards east of the Rosenberg, and it's unique in theatre history because it's the only one that has a contemporary drawing of what the inside looked like, of the little drums that you see on the maps. And it was drawn by a Dutchman, Jan de Wit, and a friend, and he has never seen anything like this before, so he gets his Vitruvius out and he writes ingressus, internal entrance, proscenium, arena, which here he notices is flat. I should have mentioned that the floor of the Rose is actually sloped. I'll come back to that then. Tectum and so on and so on. And here, a memorum mine is the actors' room. Orchestra meaning box, if you like. In English they call them the Lord's room. It's not in great perspective, but it does give us an idea of what's going on. This one, we know exactly where it was. These streets are still there. Something hasn't changed in this part of the world at all. So it's right there, so we can pinpoint it exactly. On the heritage side, I'm afraid we lose out. It would be about there. Unfortunately, this building, which is called Sampson House, it was built in the 1970s, and even then it was called brutalist architecture. Right there, it has a double-depth basement car park. We will never, ever, ever see this one, which is a pity, because DeWitt's description describes it as the biggest, most magnificent. Well, it would be because it's new. If he says it's the largest one, it's larger than the ones we know about, so it's more than 22 metres. And that seems to have started a trend, a new development in theatre design. But we lose out on that. We now, of course, come to the most world famous, wonderful thing in the world, except it's not that. It is well known that that is the globe, and this should have bear baiting H house on that one. They are transposed. Because the artist will give the engraver his sketch, and he might forget to list which is which. It happens on a number of contemporary engravings. So this is, this one's actually Globe 2. The Globe was built in 1599, partly using timbers from the theatre, not slid across the river in the middle of the night. And they're doing that because until, I was surprised, until towards the end of the 18th century, the cost of materials far outweighed the cost of labour. I thought it had probably changed earlier, but it's up to the 18th century. You can get 100 men to build that dirt cheap, but getting your bricks, your mortar, your timbers particularly, you'd go anywhere to go and find it. So the Burbage family who had the theatre bought very salvageable timbers. It happens everywhere. There's a lot of documentary evidence for it. The Hope, which we'll come to, was built out of bits of an old stable. But I think my favourite archaeological example is St Albans Cathedral. Yes, I know, I'm going chronologically wacky. Where are we, 12th, 13th century? I don't know, I'm not very good on medievals. Nice medieval cathedral. It's very largely built out of Roman brick, because that's what they found. They thought, oh, these are nice. So they used that. But we find it archaeologically all the time. It's not anything surprising at all. We have, I'm afraid, only found a very small area of the nose, and I couldn't find the colour version of that. It's just a small fragment of the edge, but we think it looks like this. We don't have enough angles to work it out at all, but the idea is that it's, if it's a 16-sided polygon, it's about 85 odd foot wide, which is 90 something, I think. And I can remember this in feet and inches, but not meters. And if it's an 18-sided polygon, it's about 95 foot across. But as you see, we've only got a small bit. The interesting thing, however, is this, which you might remember here and here. And this is, if you like, a social invention. If you went to the theatre before this time, to the playhouse, you come in from the street and you go into this yard, this sort of melee of people standing, and you pay more to go into the galleries, and it's more expensive at the top. This allows our posh theatre goers to not even have to touch all the stinking people in the middle of the yard. They can go in their own entrance at a greater cost, up to their comfortable seats at the top. And this became the norm from, as far as you can see, the early 16th century, because the Globe burnt down on 31st of June 1613, right down to the ground in apparently 2 hours, and they rebuilt it the next year. Now, there was an edict that you had to build on earlier foundations. They were worried about overcrowding as much as anyone else. And this thing is built on top of the burnt layer. You know, we find, you know, all that sort of blackening thing of great fires and so on and so on. So that has to be from Globe 2. So that's an innovation that was new to us. And that, of course, has a magnificent one. I've told you about this. Details about the height and size of the stage are another here or there. It's a working environment, and that's great. There's another one called the Fortune, built in 1600, almost certainly by the same man who built the Globe. And this one, we know exactly where it was. In fact, its building details survive. This is Golden Lane, running north from Cripplegate. And it would have been, we know that this one was rather weird because it was square. It says it's 8 foot square. And when the playhouses, bowling alleys and everything else were closed down by Parliament just before the Civil War, it was pulled down and the owners said, oh well, you know, we'll have to build some new houses to continue the rent. So we know exactly where it was, but it was square, which is odd. However, English actors worked an awful lot in Northern Europe, including Gdansk, where there's a very good record of a square building known as a Spielhaus or even a Fechthaus, a fencing house, built in 1611. And we know that English actors were there. I'm not sure what proof there is, but a lot of people would regard it as being part of the Fortune heritage, if you like. I was invited to go and see the excavations in 2004, and you can quite clearly see, instead of those trapezoidal bays of a polygon, the square bays of a square building. Now this one has undergone a, how sustainable was that? A serious renovation. And I'm not 100% certain where that is, whether it's on the site of the excavator, I hope not, or where, I don't know. It looks a bit sort of brutalist itself. But its sort of genius, if you like, is that I couldn't find a finished one. There's your square playhouse inside, and its great gizmo is to have this kind of automatic opening thing. So you can have it as an outdoor playhouse with an open roof, or close that when it rains. It's a bit like Wimbledon, I suppose. So that's an extreme one, but yeah, it's going to work for that. The Hope, built in 1614, was another very odd one because it was, we know from the documentary sources that it was partly a playhouse where plays were put on, most of Ben Jonson's plays were put on here, and partly an animal baiting arena. It didn't actually work. The actors got rather fed up for obvious reasons, and after a couple of years, it was just animals. But we found a bit of this. Our big problem was that the gap there sure ain't 12.5 foot. But then we noticed that there's different brickwork at the bottom there, and there's beginning to be an arch there, and let alone these steps. What on earth is that? To cut the story short, it's a late 17th century glass furnace built on a very conveniently shaped earlier foundation. But we do have good angles at the lower part, which tells us it's the original 1614 building. And our conjecture is that there is another outer wall, because in fact if you measure that distance and put it there, it comes to, bingo, 12.6. A quick mention on other bear baiting rings. We found a fragment of that one built in the 1540s, but then it collapsed in 1583 and then rebuilt it again. This is a completely new animal, because this is one built after the Restoration, when it was all right to kill animals again. Charles II rather liked that anyway. There were lots of these indoor playhouses about which we can say very little. There are documentary sources, largely because they were built inside existing houses. And more than that, they're built on the first floor, so the archaeological potential is not great. The famous Blackfriars Theatre would have been about there. So that's that. And other venues like the Inns of Court and Hampton Court, and so on and so on. And what was this? sorry, that is a really, really awful slide of the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. Yes, I know it should be a theatre and the Globe shouldn't be playing here. But that gives you an idea of this candle work, and Professor Martin White from Bristol has done some brilliant work on the whole lighting scenario of these indoor playhouses. And if anyone's been there, you can see how wonderful that lighting is. Right, well, I want to talk really now about the main business of these things, and that's the stage. And they were certainly small by modern times. We have that drawing of the Swan. We also have this wonderful drawing of a performance of Titus Andronicus in 1595, which happened at the Rose. We know that because a lot of the Rose documentation tells us. There is the stage. How useful is that? How sustained is that? We found that stage. But that's all we've got to go on. How are we going to learn about Shakespeare and his actors from one pen line? If we hadn't found it physically, we wouldn't. But it's still part of the history. And one of the things that we've learnt from the excavation of the globe, as I say, it's had two phases in it, is very exciting to us and to the acting world, in that the first stage, I'm going to come and perform now, the first stage is you're facing frontally. It's fairly narrow, fairly shallow at either side, and you're basically acting in one direction. But with the phase two, you've got actually now a three-sided acting forum. And you remember the pictures of the people crowding up to the front. They can crowd on three sides. And interestingly, the shape of the stage has changed dramatically. But the size, which is about 490 square feet, is almost exactly the same as the earlier one. So they've still got the space. That is, if you like, sustaining your continual stage work. And when I spoke to actors, there weren't any directors then, actors were incredibly interested in this, and they said, yes, this is what we like. Mind you, acting goes in fashion like everything else. It's the interaction with the audience. They're right in your face. And they were delighted to see what had disappeared for a long time, because when theatres came back after the Restoration, they're the flat proscenium type, which existed right up into the 20th century, just a flat frontage. And it's only really in the 1960s where you get these theatres in the round that you now see this sort of slightly more expressive way of communicating to your audience. So this shows the ancestry of that, which delighted an awful lot of actors. We've got that evidence. There's a lot of interesting documentary evidence about the backdrops, because we don't obviously find them. I went to hear a lecture a few years ago about Romeo and Juliet. And I won't go through the whole lot, we all know the story. But apparently that wretched balcony scene only ever appeared from the 1670s. It is not an original feature. What he wants to do is stand on a chair or something. You want a slight height. And we also know from Henslow's papers that props were minimal, absolutely minimal. And when we found these two pillars here, a lot of the academics said this is nonsense. You can't possibly have pillars. They're in the way. They're at the front of the stage. But actors had no problem whatsoever. They said you can lean against it, you can hug it, or you can do whatever you like to it. It's part of what is there. That's that, full stop. Get on with it. And this is one of the differences I found between the historians and the actors. So there's even a play by Green, 1598, which talks about one of the actors saying, he's wandering around in the middle of the night and he's drunk and so on, and he bumps into this post, and the words of the play are, I would hang the carpenter who put this post here. So he's bringing his acting environment, or Green, the writer, is writing for a stage which has pillars, and you notice the swan did as well. So this is a new fashion, a roof over. They weren't terribly worried about actors getting wet, but they were sure worried about their costumes getting wet. So there's an interesting development in that, and we've looked again at this crush at the front. And one of the other, I want to try and find it later. One of the other things that we know about is special effects, and one of the things we found at the Rose, and we're debating as to whether one was found at the theatre as well, there's a cannonball. We thought, what on earth's this thing? You know. So we took it off to the Tower of London, who appear to be the obvious people to take it to, and it weighs and measures the right size for a Tudor cannonball, and it's actually used to roll down a wooden slope where it makes a thunderous noise. In the Victorian period, as you probably know, they have a whopping great piece of zinc that they shake like that, but that's what they used earlier on. And there's lots of references. There's a very good description by Ben Johnson, one of his books. So there's, and there are references to fireworks and all sorts of things, trapdoors, doors in the roof, and everything. And it's all, I suppose, a bit like modern films, trying to get across new special effects to bring in bigger audiences. Basically what it's all about. Very quickly, we have a vast amount of artifacts. I think we have to admit that these money boxes with their little slots and the actual cash itself is what it was all about. Yes, it's the wonderful, glorious age of Elizabethan drama, but it's a money-making thing too. All sorts of bling, shoes, costume, everything. One of the things we wanted to look at was society amongst the audience, because these things are plotted like any archaeological dig, of course. Which area they found in might betray their original function or user. And so a lot of the pieces found in the yard and gallery area, or at least falling through the floorboards of the galleries, tell us which segment of audience are using or losing bits and pieces. And apart from these are all pretty mundane items. These are very, very poor copies of the sequins and beautiful bits of glass that the aristocrats would have sewn into their costumes. What we think is happening here, and with gold lace, except it wasn't, it was copper, is then purchasing costumes for the actors and enhancing them to make them look more gorgeous. It's a spectacle that they're trying to project. It's only with the few fragments of cloth which amazingly survived. This is lace. This is silk. That is slightly more upmarket. But it does look as though the bulk of the audience is middling, however you want to call it. And food. We know that people walked around and sold food and drink. There are a few tobacco pipes as well, but it probably wasn't that common, certainly not at that date. Consumption certainly is almost proverbial to theatre then and now. Their fare was probably a little healthier than the gin and tonic and bag of crisps that we get in today's theatres. Shellfish, we found drinking vessels, eating and serving dishes, so it's going on all around you. The dress accessories I mentioned. So, I think that's so what have we got out of this? We've got a vast amount of knowledge in that archaeology is now very much concerned with a sort of multidisciplinary Shakespeare study. Certainly compared with my Roman theatre, the remains of these things are indeed very fragile. They are, many of them either have been or being conserved as heritage sites. You've seen the Rose idea with it preserved under a glass floor. In terms of the sustainable heritage that you're looking at here, we have seen these monuments being preserved by Historic England. There are preservation orders on them. The relationship with the modern world, the entire sort of historic sources of this programme, which is going on and on, has led to a vast worldwide understanding of this phenomenon, this particular phenomenon from roughly the 1560s to 1640 on. And we're learning and reliving it now, if you like. People are changing acting styles, people are changing stage styles. And it's got sustainable solutions as well, because even if it's a heritage centre or whatever else, we're learning more about it, not only in terms of academic contacts, but in popular contexts throughout the world. Excavation, recording, publicising, preserving these sites was also very much part of the Shakespeare industry. Never mind who he was. And certainly performative spaces, which help us understand original and modern play. I mentioned the actors who are very keen on this. That relationship between actors and audience is their particular thing. We're not going to learn anything from archaeology about how they spoke or delivered. But the excavation, interestingly enough, the excavations themselves have become a theatre, if you like. They have become attractions. A lot of our, starting with the Globe, and it will happen at the Curtain as well, that archaeologists are now, if you like, actors on an ancient stage, with the London public walking past being the audience. So there's a full circle, if you like, that engages archaeology with heritage, with attraction. It's all running together. There are lots of different cultures and heritages, and in fact, one of my very favourite ones is the Palazzo, the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza, built by Palladio, one of the most fantastic architects ever. And I put this here because this was built in the mid-1580s. It is completely contemporary with those flimsy wooden playhouses of London, whereas this gorgeous marble thing was a completely different kettle of fish. But, whoops, in the modern vernacular, Shakespeare's all over London. Shakespeare didn't play Vicenza. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. Very thought-provoking, extremely interesting. We've got time, a few minutes for questions. And if I could ask you if you could introduce yourself and any affiliation when you ask your question, please.
David Lee. Could you just clarify that exciting debunking you did about the Globe wasn't built from reusing timbers from the theatre? But then later on I thought you said it was. So I'm not sure whether to be disappointed or excited.
You've got 2 minutes.
Right, okay. In 1570, it's partly Burbage's fault, it was a complete cretin. In 1576, however, when he took a lease on the land, and this was something then owned, his lease, I'm not going to complicate it by the rows he had with his brother-in-law, he had the option to take down some of the buildings that were already there, and anything that he might build. He took that land specifically to build a playhouse. He was supposed to have spent £200 on restoring other buildings in the plot, which we found slightly, and he would use as a storeroom or whatever else. Then there's a big argument that he didn't. I suspect they're right, I suspect he didn't actually know him. In April 15, he died in February 1597. The 21-year lease ran out in April 1597, and his sons, Richard and Cuthbert, thought, right, we need to renegotiate the lease, which they'd also talked about renegotiating the lease 10 years earlier, but that fell through. And they started discussing this with the landowner, who said, well, you know, you can carry on using it if you like. The discussion went on for over a year, and they thought, I'm fed up with this, nothing's going to happen, let's go. So they went and they dismantled it because they were trying to find another piece of land. They did find another piece of land. It's very expensive to build these things. It cost about £700, which is an obscene amount of money in today's terms. So they dismantled it, took the main timbers. They're not going to reuse thatch and all that sort of stuff, or tiles or whatever else. And they took it onto the bankside site where they were going to build a new one, which they called the Globe. But what we know of Tudor building practices is that they dig foundations first, and it would probably be into the summer when it's dry enough to start doing the timber, which of course, as you know, is all prefabricated. Well, the landlord didn't like this, and the myth is he woke up the next morning and thought, gosh, where's that gone? That's nonsense. He was actually living out in Essex, which is miles and miles away. But it had gone, and he sued the actors and the Burbage brothers, who also brought in, the Burbage brothers realised they had financial problems, thanks to Dad. They brought in a lot of actors, 5 actors, including William Shakespeare, to be shareholders because they needed some money. And the interesting thing about how much they took from the theatre can be put against what we know that they had to spend on top of that. They had to spend £400 on finishing the Globe, so they certainly didn't have enough money, enough material to do a new one. The damage that's been done by this myth is that the Globe is merely a re-erected theatre. We know from actually fairly careful reading of the law transcripts tell you that they built it in another form, for example, and I think there's another similar description. But we've actually excavated both sites, and we've got a pretty good idea of how big the theatre was. We've got a vague idea of how big the Globe was, and although, as I've shown you, we haven't got exact measurements, it's certainly bigger than the theatre. So that's as I say, what annoys me about that myth, because it doesn't really admit to the development, the sort of lineal development of these buildings. So they're going to change and get better, like most other buildings do. In the end, the landlord lost the law case. He tried to sue them again, in fact, into about 2 years after the Globe was built, but it was finally killed. They were right. They were allowed to take down their timber. Sorry. Very quick.
Okay, we've got 2 questions.
Hello, Simon MacDonald, postgraduate alumna of Shakespeare Institute. You mentioned that the floor of the Rose was raked.
Yes.
Does one presume it was raked down towards the stage?
Oh yes. Sorry. How do I do this? Sorry, I wanted to go back some way. Yeah, sorry. Right. Yes, it slopes from here down to the stage. The first stage, the 1582 stage. That's the 1592 stage. It's fairly even to about here, and then it breaks down. But one thing I forgot to say is that this area of the excavation was very, very mushy and messed up, and you could see new layers, and it's quite obvious it was getting wet and nasty. Because although it's logical to stand here and thereby see over the heads of the people standing there, it was causing a lot of drainage problems there. We found what might have been a drain in that corner, but otherwise we have no idea how this thing was drained. We are 99% certain that that erosion line there is water dripping off the eaves of the galleries, because they're thatched and therefore are not gutted. But we came up with what we like to think is virtually the only well, I'm sure there are other examples, archaeological evidence for human behaviour. And I think this erosion here is not just wet. I think that is, as I kept on mentioning, and forgot to say this, it's those people pressing against the front of the stage, right up against it. And as somebody mentioned to me, because I was fast to understand what they were talking about, that's Tudor moshing, essentially. That's why I kept on going on about the evidence of people at the front. I think we've got that. And the theatre management think, oh crikey, there's been another puddle down here. In fact, even when we were excavating, we were getting water coming up, not coming down. Well, we got it coming down somewhere, it's coming up. So, but it's built in a nasty, marshy place. And that's why if you remember Do its thing, it's an arena, that's fine. Planetiers, flat, level. They've learned a lesson. In fact, even the second phase floor of the Rose is a lot, it's got a teeny weeny drop, but the drop in the first one is well over a foot. But he wasn't having any of that nonsense. Or Langley, who built this one, he's obviously thought, nah, we wouldn't do that. See what a mess they've made over there.
Shall we take this question here?
Yeah,
Please.
I'm Grace Jarvis. I'm an archaeology student at the IOA and I'm also a steward at the Globe Theatre. There's a lot of, you were talking about sustainability for the future of Shakespeare, and I do think the Globe is a fantastic opportunity for people to see Shakespeare.
Absolutely.
As would. Or as was. There's a new director of the Globe who's making some quite controversial changes to, she's adding lighting and sound effects and things like that, which to me doesn't feel it links in with the sustainability of going forward.
I know what you mean, and they've also done, if you remember, those peculiar things like putting a catwalk out from the stage and all that sort of stuff. And there has been a debate at the Globe about what they're going to do with the stage because they feel uncomfortable about it. There's that business about the wings at the edge, so you can actually have a three-cornered, three-directional acting area. They're uncomfortable about that as well, but yeah, with lots of ifs and buts, I still think it's a fantastic opportunity.
Oh, yeah.
You can't have everything.
No, but they do use the cannonball thing that you would.
Yes, I know.
They use the bowling ball now.
Yeah,
They have a little crate they push around.
Yeah. No, I think they've done a wonderful job, and one of the other nice things about the Globe is that they've got a very, well, you're obviously part of it, you know about, a very, very vibrant educational centre as well. And we at the museum occasionally come and teach there. We've got an MA programme with King's College London that study Shakespearean studies or something like that. We've been working with that as well. Not on the literary thing, I hasten to add, but on the historical stuff. But yes, they're a very vibrant bunch. They might be slightly globe-centric, but who can blame them?
Please.
Norman Hammond. Is the hypothetical new square plan for the curtain based in any way on the Fortune contract?
No, because it's a lot earlier than the Fortune.
No, but I mean the hypothetical restoration you've done. What's that based on?
Well, we didn't do. I might pass this also over to Heather Knight, who was doing the excavations there. But as far as I understand it, you have found walls that suggest it's a square. Why and wherefore?
Yeah,
I have
that
no
conjecture Julian showed earlier is based on the limited amounts of walls we found. So give us a couple of months and we'll have to tell you exactly the size of it.
Okay.
But no, it's not based on documentary or any other sources.
No.
It's actually based on
You've got
archaeology.
walls on at least two sides, have you?
We've got
Yes.
walls on 3 sides.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
So, but as I say, I mean, we think the one in Newington Butts, the unnamed playhouse in Newington Butts, we think that's there are good reasons which I haven't got in my head at the moment. That was also in a reused building, but so what? The Fortune was actually a purpose-built one. Why that was square? Maybe the other way around. Maybe that is copying the curtain if that one is square. Who knows? And that's what makes this forthcoming excavation very interesting, because the man who, as I say, we know a lot about the theatre because James Burbage was embroiled in legal cases every day, so we know a lot about him. Henslow kept records, so we know about that. The curtain, the man who owned that for at least quite a period of its lifetime, Henry Laneman, was very shrewd. He kept his nose very, very clean. So he doesn't appear in criminal records or anything like that. But it's one of the buildings we don't know that much about. So if we learn more from Heather's work about its physical projection, we might learn something about its use and its history as well. One thing we do know is that that building that was once a playhouse was converted, or in fact, as I rather think, reverted back into tenements in the 1630s, and in fact, one even pulled down until the end of the 17th century. But then we've got plenty of year-old buildings with us still today. But yeah, it's going to be a very interesting one. Whereas, you know, if we dig up, I don't know, the theatre or something, yes, it's another Rose-type building, it's another Globe-type building. This is different. This is interesting.
Any more questions? Please.
I'm Brian Edwards. Just kind of interesting. You mentioned something about how the foundations were laid first and then left before building.
Yeah,
is that was that from various different sites, or was that?
No, you're asking an awkward question because I can't remember the details, but a bit. We've looked at possibly hundreds of buildings from the 16th, 17th century, and they're all the same sort of thing. If they're modest ones, they've got stone or brick footings within a trench, footings trench. Then they've got whopping great sleeper timbers. Then they've got 2 or 3 courses of brickwork, so the sills, the sleeper timbers, are off the ground. Then you build your FX kit on top.
So when you're excavating, have you found much timber? Or is it
fragments? There are 1 or 2 fragments from the Rose, none from the Globe. Have you got? No, right. Okay. we found 1 or 2 fragments from the Rose. And the other thing I was going to show you. There we go. The Rose and the Globe has been fully published as a sort of an academic book, which is now sold out. We've also fully published the very limited excavations on Hope, and we've published a silly book about London's theatre. But there will be more to come. I mean, there's the theatre and the Globe to come. The southernmost of those 3 bear-baiting rings, the Davis one built in 1662, that's, well, it's not quite in proof stage, but it's largely written. It'll be a very large article around
I was in London. I was just going to do a little plug for, so you could see the finds from some of them at the Museum of London on permanent display.
Yes.
But also at Globe Theatre, where they had quite a big exhibition.
They've had their bits and pieces from us for years.
And also we're opening a small display next week that will run for the summer with more finds. And the British Library is doing something big, some openings.
The British Library had the cannonball.
Yes, they do that.
And something else, I can't remember what else.
One little that's all they want.
Large. And various films have been made by various documentary people about certain events from the Rose and so on and so on. Some of which are going to be shown at the World Shakespeare Congress, which is happening in London and Stratford this year. There's going to be about 1,000 Shakespeare fanatics in town. So it's an audience we don't want to know.
Okay, I'm going to draw this to a close. Can we give a round of applause to Julian? I'm sure that Julian won't mind being approached informally over a glass of wine, which you're all invited to upstairs on the first floor. So please do join us if you can.
Yeah. Yeah.